Okay, we are continuing on our study on the life and the ministry of the Apostle Paul. We left off last week. We left Paul in Athens, and there was one other thing that I wanted one point I wanted to make real briefly about Athens before we go on to Corinth, because after he leaves Athens, he goes into Corinth. Says that on the whole, the apostles' preaching, he didn't have a lot of success at Athens. He was there for a while, but he really did not have much success there. There's no church in the Bible mentioned by the name of Athens. We don't hear of a lot of course, the place was steeped in idolatry and full of philosophers, and he just did not have a lot of success there. The minds of the philosophers of that celebrated city were too much occupied with their own frivolous pursuits to attend to any important subject. That's just the way things are, and sometimes that's the way it is in different cities that we might go into. Certain places you're just not going to have any luck. When we lived in California, I can't tell you the number of time, the amount of time we spent trying to find somebody out there, and nothing. There's a couple of people scattered here and there, but aside from that, couldn't find much of anything. It's just certain areas that they're just not ripe for it, and Athens was one of those. And so we read in chapter 18, verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Now I want you to remember something about what had gone on. Paul, when he was in Berea, before he went to Athens, when he left Berea, you remember that he left Timothy and Silas behind in Berea. And then when he got to Athens, he sent word for them to come to him. Okay? Well, they hadn't gotten to him yet. That word hadn't gotten to him. We also find from something we'll look at here in a few minutes that he had also at that time sent Timothy back to Thessalonica. So while Silas and Timothy were in Berea, Timothy went back to Thessalonica. Paul was very, very concerned about what was going on in Thessalonica. He'd been run out of town, and he had that little church there that he'd started, and he was so concerned about him, he wanted Timothy to go up there and try to strengthen him some. Then when he got to Athens, which is something like 250 miles away from Berea, it's a long walk. It takes a while to get that far. By the time he had gotten to Athens, then he sent word for Timothy and Silas to come meet him, but they hadn't met him yet. We're going to see where they pick up with him in Corinth. That's going to be important as we move forward, that you understand that kind of a timeline. So Paul is still without Silas and Timothy. They're still making their way from Macedonia, from Thessalonica and Berea to meet up with him, and now he's leaving Athens and he's headed to Corinth. They will meet up with him in Corinth. Okay? And like I said, that's going to be important here a little bit later on. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. Now, you remember very early on in this study that I was talking about a period of time when Emperor Claudius was one that launched persecution against the Jews. Well, this was the same Emperor Claudius. He reigned from, I think it was about 41 AD till 54 AD. That kind of puts us into that time frame of where we are now. And he had come to the conclusion that all Jews had to depart, get out of Rome. Can't live in Rome. So Priscilla and Aquila, who were from Rome, left and went to Corinth, and that's where Paul met them. And we've looked at these. We looked at them before when we did our study on the book of Romans. You'll remember we discussed Aquila and Priscilla then. Their names are mentioned 6 times in Scripture. Let's just go ahead and take a look at these. It won't take but a few minutes, but we can glean some information about them. In Acts chapter 18, which is where we are, verses 18 and 19, it says, "And Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with them Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow, and he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews." So we see that he meets them in Corinth, and now they start to travel with him. And they travel with him as far as Ephesus, and then they stay there. They stay in Ephesus as Paul moves on, and we'll see some more of that this morning. And that's gonna prove providential as we continue on with this. In Romans chapter 16, and you'll remember that they were from Rome. Romans chapter 16, verses 3 through 5, Paul writes and he says, "Likewise greet 3. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my helpers in Christ Jesus, who have for my life laid down their own necks, unto whom not only I give thanks, but also all of the churches of the Gentiles. Likewise greet the church that is in their house." So they had gone home, and Paul's recognizing the fact that they've gone home to Rome, and there's a church in their house there in Rome. So they had left Rome, went to Corinth, met Paul there, traveled with him to Ephesus, and we're going to see that they kind of weave in and out of this story. Well, now at this point, when he wrote the letter to the Romans, they're back in Rome again. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and verse 19, we read, "The churches of Asia salute you, Aquila and Priscilla salute you much in the Lord, with the church that is in their house." Now this is when Paul's writing to the church at Corinth. He's just now getting to Corinth. Years later he's writing this letter to them, referring to Priscilla and Aquila, who he had met at Corinth, who are now in Rome, and they have a church in their house, and they're saying howdy to the folks in Corinth. And then in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 9, Second Timothy chapter 4 and verse 9, we read, "Do thy..." 4:19. Got dyslexic again. "Salute Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus abode at Corinth, but Trophimus I have left at Miletum sick." So they're mentioned once again. Priscilla and Aquila, they were husband and wife, married missionaries, involved in the teaching of Apollos, as we're going to see a little bit later. I don't know if we'll get to it this morning or not, but when Apollos understood some things but didn't understand them all, Priscilla and Aquila were there to help him out, and Paul refers to them as his helpers, and this is when he meets them. And in verse 3 of chapter 18 it says, "And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers." Now remember, very early on I explained to you that at this time in the first century, even though Paul had gone to college and got, in essence, a PhD degree, it was still tradition and custom for the family to teach someone a trade, something they could work with their hands in case they ever needed to. And his family had taught him to be a tent maker. So now when he meets Priscilla and Aquila, lo and behold, they're tent makers as well. So that's where he stayed early on in Corinth, was with Priscilla and Aquila, and they were tent makers, and they actually worked that craft in order to provide income for themselves for a while. Right, I think we've already looked at that. Okay. Now, the next thing that we see that happens, it says, "And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And then Silas and Timothy arrive. In verse 5, and when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. So it seems like once they arrived, he started getting busy again. Now, there's a note relative to Timothy that we find. Stay here, keep your fingers here, but look over at 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. First Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. And this will tell you how it was that Timothy had gotten to Thessalonica to begin with. Remember, they were in Berea. Paul left. Timothy and Silas stayed. This tells us how it was that Timothy went to Berea. Wherefore, when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone. Remember, he went to Athens. And sent Timotheus, our brother and minister of God and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. So that's how we know that Paul had sent him from Berea into Thessalonica to help establish that church. That no man should be moved by these afflictions, for yourselves know that we are appointed thereunto. For verily, when we were with you, we told you before that we should suffer tribulation, even as it came to pass, and you know. For this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter have tempted you, and our labor be in vain. But now, when Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you. So that's how that transpired. Paul had sent Timothy into Thessalonica because he was worried about this little church. He'd got a church started and got run out of town, and he was concerned about it. So he sent Timothy there to make sure that things were okay. And then Timothy came back, met him in Corinth, and gave him word that things are fine. Everything's moving along fine. It's always helpful to know. I remember we had a Timothy in this church that called me every Sunday during that period from June when we started the church until Wendy and I moved down here the following year. There was a Timothy in the church that's sitting in that chair over there that called me every Sunday to let me know how things were going, and everything seems to be okay and things are moving along. And you know, that's very helpful, because you don't know. If you don't have eyes on it, you just don't know what's going on. Are the people meeting? Are they still there? Is everybody still interested? And you all were listening to tapes and listening to a bunch of different things, and so that's very helpful. So I can understand Paul wanting to know what was going on with that little church that he'd gotten started. And we read then back in Acts chapter 18. When Silas and Timotheus were come, this is verse 5, from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. Now I'm going to have some things to say regarding this in a few minutes, but I want to cover this point first. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 45, we've already seen this happen. And I made the point last week that the same thing keeps popping up over and over and over again. These unbelieving Jews keep coming in and stirring up trouble. Wherever the Apostle Paul goes, it's not long until the unbelieving Jews show up and start causing problems. Acts chapter 13 and verse 45. We read, but when the Jews saw the multitudes, they were filled with envy and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. Same thing again. And here it's happening again in Corinth. In Ezekiel chapter 33, I want to show you why it was that Paul felt it necessary to continue to go to the Jews first, even though he was the apostle to the Gentiles. There was a reason that he did it. Ezekiel chapter 33. And verse 4 says this. Well, let's get the context. Let's just start at the first verse. Again, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of thy people, and say unto them, when I bring the sword upon a land, if the people of the land take a man of their coasts, and set him for their watchman, if when he seeth the sword come upon the land, he blow the trumpet and warn the people, then whosoever heareth the sound of the trumpet and taketh not warning, if the sword come and take him away, his blood shall be upon his own head. Paul was warning the Jews. And if they don't listen, their blood's on their own head. That's why he said, I'm free from the blood of you. It's basically on your own head. I'm doing my job. I'm warning you. And if you're not going to listen, it's on you. That was one of the things that I wanted to talk about. Also he said much the same in Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, verses 26 and 27. He said, For I have not shunned to declare unto you all the counsel of God. Take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over the which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers. He's talking, I'm in the wrong passage, aren't I? Yes, I am. 26 and 27. Wherefore I take you to record this day that I am pure from the blood of all men, for I have not shunned to declare unto you the counsel of God. That's what I was looking for. That was Paul's responsibility. When he would go into these towns and preach to the Jews, even though the Jews would reject him, he still had the responsibility to preach to them. He was still there to teach them so that they could never stand before God and say, you never told us this. And Paul felt it was his responsibility to make sure that at least they heard. But there was a point at which where he just, here in Corinth, where he'd had enough. He'd had enough of it and kind of lost it there for a minute. If we go back to Ezekiel chapter 3, Ezekiel chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way, to save his life, the same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. And do you see the problem that comes before a pastor of a church? Sometimes we have to say things that we really don't want to say. But if we see someone and we have to warn them, and I've had to do a lot of warning, and sometimes people will thank me for it, and other times they'll get mad at me and storm out the door. But if I don't do it, and something happens to them, it's on me. And that's what Paul was dealing with. If he saw something, he had to make it known, otherwise their blood was going to be on his head. His point is, I'm free from the blood of you. I've done the job that I was supposed to do. Look at Ezekiel 33 and verse 9. We were just there a minute ago. Nevertheless, if thou warn the wicked of his way to turn from it, if he do not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. Now that's something that pastors have to consider. And we're told sometimes we have to rebuke people if they're doing something wrong. If we don't do it and they fall into trouble, guess who gets to pay for it? We get to pay just like you do. That's why sometimes we have to come down and play the part of the bad guy. It's part of the gig, and that's what one of the things that Paul was trying to say here, that he was free from. Where are we? Acts 18. When they opposed and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go into the Gentiles." And he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshipped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogue. Joined hard to the synagogue means it was pretty much attached to the synagogue. It was a house that was attached to it. And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house, and many of the Corinthians were believed and were baptized. I'm not sure how I'm going to get this point across, but I need to get it across. So he turns to the Gentiles, and now there's a whole bunch of. He's got some converts. He's got some people converted there in Corinth. And then an interesting thing happens in verse 9. Then spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision. Be not afraid, but speak, and hold not thy peace. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. Paul receives a vision from the Lord. I want you to think about. Let's look at the human side of this for a minute. Paul was a man. He wasn't a huge man. He stood about 5'6". And flip over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 just for a second. And put yourself in his shoes for a minute if you can. Here he is, traveling around the Roman Empire, preaching the gospel, setting up churches, doing what he believes he was called to do. And look at what he says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We're going to start at verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool, I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods. Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils by my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, times when he couldn't even eat, in cold and nakedness, besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Put yourself in this man's position for a minute. And he stands up in a synagogue and preaches the gospel, and people throw things at him and chase him out of town again. There's gonna come a point in time when you don't want to do this anymore. And every minister that I know, and myself included, has reached a point at times when you don't want to do this anymore. And the Apostle Paul he had so much more going than one of us normal people have. There's something that Ben Mott read to me at my ordination. Now this was a warning to me. I'm not going to address this to me. I'm going to address this to the Apostle Paul. I want you to think in terms of the Apostle Paul as I read this, because it holds true for all of us. We have all felt this at one time or another. You know, when I was a kid, I used to look forward to phone calls, because there was always somebody that wanted to go. You want to go do something? You know, you want to go to the fair, you want to go fishing, you want to go to a con, you want to do something? It's always something exciting that was going on. And then I became a pastor, and 98% of the phone calls I get, they're not that. They're not that. It's somebody taking issue with something that I said, or somebody has a question about this, or somebody has a problem with this, somebody has something else, somebody wants to yell at me, somebody, to the point where I don't even want to answer the phone anymore. That's part of the ministry. That's part of what comes with it. And I'm just one guy with a tiny little church. Can you imagine the pressure that was on the Apostle Paul? So think of that as I read this. Point this towards Paul. And think of him as I go through this. This is written by Charles Spurgeon. It's in a book called Lectures to My Students. And it refers to the minister's fainting fits, which basically that's an old style way of saying depression, because every one of us from time to time get depressed and want to quit. And I can feel, this is something I can feel the Apostle Paul, I don't know exactly what he was going through, but I got a pretty good idea. And this is what Ben read to me. A minister fully equipped for his work will usually be a spirit by himself, above, beyond, and apart from others. The most loving of his people cannot enter into his peculiar thoughts, cares, and temptations. In the ranks, men walk shoulder to shoulder with many comrades, but as the officer rises in rank, men of his standing are fewer in number. There are many soldiers, few captains, fewer colonels, but only one commander-in-chief. So in our churches, the man whom the Lord raises as a leader becomes in the same degree in which he is a superior man, a solitary man. The mountaintops stand solemnly apart and talk only with God as he visits their terrible solitudes. Men of God who rise above their fellows into nearer communion with heavenly things, in their weaker moments feel the lack of human sympathy. Like their Lord in Gethsemane, they look in vain for comfort to the disciples sleeping around them. They are shocked at the apathy of their little band of brethren and return to their secret agony with all the heavier burden pressing upon them, because they have found their dearest companion slumbering. No one knows but he who has endured it, the solitude of a soul which has outstripped its fellows in zeal for the Lord of hosts. It dare not reveal itself, lest men count it mad. It cannot conceal itself, for a fire burns within its bones. Only before the Lord does it find rest. Our Lord, sending out his disciples by two and two, manifested that he knew what was in men. But for such a man as Paul, and that's what I want you to think of. Think of Paul here. Such a man as Paul, it seems to me that no helpmeet was found. Barnabas or Silas or Luke were hills too low to hold high converse with such a Himalayan summit as the apostle of the Gentiles. This loneliness, which if I mistake it not is felt by many of my brethren, is a fertile source of depression, and our ministers' fraternal meetings and cultivation of holy intercourse with kindred minds will, with all God's blessing, help us to greatly escape the snare. The one thing that I've had that Paul didn't have is I've had men above me that are better than I am, that I can go to and talk to. And without that, I don't know that you can make it. So I try to put myself in the position of the Apostle Paul. I mean, nobody likes rejection, folks. Nobody likes people throwing stuff at you. Nobody goes out here for that. And that's what Paul kept facing over and over and over. Every time he would preach, somebody's got to take issue with him. Unbelieving Jews have got to go start another riot with him again. And so that's why he made the statement, I'm done. I'm going to the Gentiles. And the Lord said, no, I'm with you. You know, there's a passage that where Paul had I don't remember where it is, but he had an infirmity in his flesh that he prayed for numerous times that the Lord would take it away from him, and the Lord wouldn't take it away. And he said, my strength is sufficient for you. And so with the Lord with him, it's the only way that the man could continue. So that's one, if nothing else, try to remember who it is that we're talking. He's a man. Paul was a man, the same as the rest of us. And yet here he is traveling under these conditions with the purpose in mind of setting up these churches to build up churches under the gospel. And he went through the same kind of stuff that every other minister went through. He goes through the same thing that you go through. And I don't know any of us that want to stand up and talk and then have people throw stuff at us. But it happened. One of the interesting things that we run into in these days is that a lot of the people, they don't attack you straight on. They write things about you on the internet that you can't do anything about, that are just out there. But at least Paul didn't have to deal with that one. Okay. Now, so we read where the Lord said, I'm with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So from the standpoint of almost quitting, he now stays there for 1.5 years. Stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching that church. And during the time, we're told this. Look at Philippians chapter 4. Now you remember, a few steps back, there was that church in Philippi that he'd gotten started. You remember that one? That's the one where Luke stayed. Luke had met him in Troas. They traveled from Troas to Philippi together, and Paul was thrown in jail. The Philippian jailer was converted. Paul left Philippi, and Luke stayed there. So you remember that church in Philippi. That was a couple of churches ago. And this is the letter that he wrote to the Philippians. Chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Say, now ye Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica ye sent once and again unto my necessity. Not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 8 and 9. Let's look at verse 7. Have I committed an offense in abasing myself, that ye might be exalted, because I preached to you the gospel of God freely? And this is Corinth. So when he was in Corinth, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. And when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man, for that which was lacking me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I've kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so I will keep myself. So for that 1.5 years that he was in Corinth, wasn't even taking a salary from him. He was making tents, and the Philippian church was sending him money, and other churches were sending him money, and that's how he existed for the 1.5 years that he was in Corinth. And then we have an interesting thing that happens. The fellow that writes that book that I keep referring to, Smith, he says this. He said, a new source of doing good also appears to have opened itself to the apostle's mind about this time. Hitherto his labors had been confined to preaching merely, but during his stay at Corinth, he wrote his epistles to the Thessalonians, which are now almost universally acknowledged to be the first productions of his pen remaining in existence. In the editions of the New Testament commonly in use, which he wrote back in the early 1800s, so he's talking about the King James, that's all we had back then. The postscript to these epistles bears that they were written from Athens. And you know, if you look at Thessalonians, you'll see that little tiny writing at the end, it'll say they were written from Athens. Well, folks, that's not inspired. The center column references aren't inspired. That's something that somebody wrote, okay? And it makes absolutely no sense, as he's going to point out, and he does a much better job of it than I would. It's obviously an error, for in the first place, they are written in the joint names of Paul, Silvanus, who is Silas, and Timotheus. Now you see why it was important that you know where they were? Remember early in this lesson, I said that Paul had left Silas and Timothy in Berea when he went to Athens, and they didn't catch up with him again until he was in Corinth. And in Corinth, he wrote these letters to the Thessalonians, and he addressed them from himself, Silas, and Timotheus. How would he address it from Paul, Silas, and Timotheus if they were still in Thessalonica and hadn't gotten to him yet when he was in Athens? So whoever it was that came up with the idea that Paul wrote these from Athens is just simply mistaken. That's not where they were written. Now Silas was not at Athens, although he subsequently joined Paul at Corinth. In the second place, at the period when the first epistle was written, there was, as we read in the epistle itself, a church established in Achaia. But there was no such church there till Paul had left Athens and gone to Corinth. And finally, the apostle mentions not only Timotheus' departure to Thessalonica, but also his return, which we know took place at Corinth, so that no reasonable doubt can possibly exist with regard to the time and place when these epistles were written. Now I want you to look first at Acts chapter 18:5, which is back where we were. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. That's when Paul and Silas got back to Paul, and that was in Corinth, not Athens. He'd already left Athens. And also, if we look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 and 7. But now when Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, and that ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, we were comforted over you in all our afflictions and distress by your faith. And when was it that he came to them? It was in Corinth. So it was from Corinth that Paul wrote both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And there's a reason for that. There were some of the things that were written in 1 Thessalonians that people didn't understand. There was a movement at that time that when they read the letter, the 1 Thessalonian letter that they read, they came to the conclusion that the day of judgment was at hand, that at any moment Christ was going to return. And Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians to tell them, no, that's not how it works. There's going to be a time period between now and when that finally occurs. Let's look at 2 Thessalonians, and I don't have this in my notes, but in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it says, Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto you, that ye be not soon shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as the day of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Until certain things are going to happen, Christ is not going to return. So don't be upset with that. And he also had written in, I think it was in 1 Thessalonians, because there appears to have been an issue about those thinking that those that had already passed away were gone. It's kind of is it the Jehovah's Witnesses that believe that? I think that's who that is. That they believe that if you're not alive at the second coming, well, then you just turn into dust. That there's no future. There's only going to be 144,000 people in heaven. Seems a little, doesn't seem like very many, does it? There's that many at a Packer game. So I don't know how in the world heaven's going to be pretty empty. Social distancing. I guess they practice social distancing in heaven according to the Jehovah's Witnesses, because you got heaven bigger than the world and you've only got 144,000 people in it. So that's going to be a lonely place. But anyway, they had come to that idea where they thought that you had to be alive. And Paul corrected that in 1 Thessalonians. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, but I would not have you be ignorant, brethren, concerning them which are asleep, those that have already died and gone ahead, that you sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent or precede them which are asleep. For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, and with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God, and the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Wherefore comfort one another with these words. So what Paul is saying here is that when Christ returns, he's going to take all those souls of the people that have died ahead of us, he's bringing them back. All of us that are alive will be changed. The graves will give up the bodies of the souls that he's got and reunite it all, and we'll all be together at one time. Soul, spirit, body, the whole thing, all wrapped up at one time, and we'll always be with God from that point forward. So in this letter he was saying, don't worry about those that have gone before, but somehow they had gotten the conclusion that it's right around the corner. And so the second letter was written to try to tell them that wasn't the case. Okay, back to Acts chapter 18, verses 12 through 17. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, okay, here he is standing before the judge, he's getting ready to offer his defense, and the judge won't let him. Stops him right there before he even gets anything out. It says, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. In other words, if this guy had done something, if he had robbed a bank, if he had done something illegal, well, I'd listen to you, okay? But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I'll be no judge of such a matter. So they haul him before the judge. The judge says, there's no standing here. I'm not going to judge based on your religion. That's not what I'm going to do. For I will be no judge of such a matter. And he drave them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of these things. Now, I'm not exactly sure who it was that beat the guy or who the guy was that they beat. But this particular judge was going to have nothing to do with, just like some of the others that we read about, or that we're going to read about as we get a little bit farther on. So they had no interest in what they viewed as just being superstition. You remember Pontius Pilate. He didn't want to deal with what they'd thrust on him. That's a religious issue. That's not something that he wanted to get involved in. His name was Lucius Junius Gallio Annaeus, if you look him up. He was a Roman senator. He was a brother of a famous writer called Seneca, and he's best remembered for this act right here. So if you go look him up on Google or something, there's information about him out there. And one of the things that a point that I want to make from this is that even though evil man might want to punish someone for being a Christian, that does not necessarily mean they're going to get their way. Even if they want to, that doesn't mean that they're going to get their way. Always remember and never forget that God is still in control of what goes on down here. He is ultimately in control of everything that happens down here. And nothing is going to happen to you that He does not allow to happen to you. And if He allows it to happen to you, then it was His will that it happened, and we should want to comply with His will. Don't fear. This is one of the things that I see in Paul. He was never afraid of any of these guys. He wasn't afraid of Caesar. He didn't fear any of those guys. Even though he was being drugged forward, and we're going to see that later in this study, that didn't faze him. He was ready to defend himself before this guy, and the guy stopped him and shut him off at the pass. Didn't need to defend himself. The guy wasn't going to hear the case anyway. So understand that God is always and ultimately in control of whatever goes on with. Now, you go do something stupid, you might have to suffer the consequences for your own actions. But when it comes to things like this, God's in control. Whatever happens between now and the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I'll give you a couple of examples. Daniel chapter 6. Now, we don't need to read the whole thing, but Daniel chapter 6 talks about the time when Nebuchadnezzar had set up a statue. Oh, no. This is the other one. This is the time when you were not allowed to pray to any god other than Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel continued to pray and let him see him do it, and they ended up throwing him in a den of lions. Remember the story, right? Everybody knows the story of Daniel in the lion's den. It's detailed in Daniel chapter 6. What happened? God shut the mouth of the lions. They didn't harm him at all. The next morning, there he was. He was fine. They lifted him up out of the lion's den. These men had intended to do harm to the man, and God saw to it that it wouldn't happen. In Daniel chapter 3, we have the occasion where he had built that god and wanted everybody to bow down to it. And it says that the king made an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And he commanded that everybody bow down to it, and there were these 3 Jewish boys who wouldn't bow down to it. And so he threw them in a fiery furnace. What happened? Next morning, they're still walking around. They're fine. Weren't even singed. Now, God can protect you from lions, and He can protect you from that. Look at the book of Esther. And I'm not going to read the entire book of Esther, but you might want to take a look at this later when you get home. It's really a pretty interesting story. It's over in the historical books. Just before the book of Job, right after Nehemiah. And Esther was a Jewess who had married the king of Persia. Now, he didn't know she was Jewish, but his first wife refused to come to him when he called her, and so he cast her aside and went after somebody else. It's good to be the king, you know. And any of you married guys, at one time you call your wife and she doesn't hear you and ignores you. Well, if you were a king, you could just go get another wife. But But I'm sure that has never happened with anyone in this room, right? Anyway, he looked for the most beautiful woman in the land, and he lands on Esther. And so he marries Esther, and he had a chief, captain, second in command, head honcho kind of guy. His name was Haman, and Haman really thought he was something special. And there was a guy by the name of Mordecai. Most people pronounce it Mordecai, but if you look at the actual spelling, it's Mordecai, that refused to bow down to him. He was Jewish. He wasn't going to bow down to a man. That's idolatry. So Mordecai refused to bow down to him, and it made Haman mad. It made him so mad that he wanted to kill the guy. And but you can't just go out and kill one guy, right? That might give your secret away that you're just jealous of that one guy. So he devises a plan. And the plan that he devised was, how about if we just kill all the Jews? We'll kill them all. That way I'll get rid of the guy that I don't want, and it won't look like it's me. I'll make up a story about what Jews do. So he goes in and talks to the king. Now, all of you married people know this. All of you guys know this. There is a time when you could almost get away with anything. Now, it's different in everybody's life. But in my life, I could almost, if there's a hockey game on, and Wendy's watching the Lightning play, I would lay, if I were a betting man, I would lay you dollars to donuts that I could convince her that I could buy a brand new $50,000 yacht if there's only 2 minutes left in the game and the Lightning are tied 1-1 and she's intently watching the game. I could get away with anything. Because you know what? She's not paying attention to me. She's not listening. She might look like she is, but she's watching the hockey game. So Haman goes into the king at one of these times and slips this little piece of paper by him when king's not paying any attention. He's watching the Lightning game. So he goes ahead and signs it off. Well, now it's on the books. They're going to kill the Jews. And Mordecai goes to Esther, the king's wife, and there's a really, I hope I can find it. And the queen, Esther, she's afraid to go to him because the rule is you don't go to the king unless the king calls you. And Mordecai, who I believe was her uncle, was telling her, you need to go talk to the king. He doesn't realize that you're Jewish. He doesn't know that he's going to kill you too if this law goes through. And in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, it says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? How do you know that the exact reason that you're in the position you're in is to take this stand right now? And so she did, and things worked out. That's the shortened version of it. Now you might want to read the book. It's really a cool story. Haman gets it in the end. It's one of those where the bad guy actually gets it in the end, gets hung on the very gallows that he wanted to hang Mordecai on. And that came about because there's, let me see if I can find this. There was a time when Mordecai had warned some of the people that there was a conspiracy going on to get the king, and nothing had. I mean, they thwarted the conspiracy, and in chapter 6, it says, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the books of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, Bigthana, there's a name for you, huh? If I could change, my father's middle initial was B. He was born Clarence B. Henderson, no name, just B. And when he joined the CCC camps, which was something that went on during the Depression, he had to always sign his name, Clarence B. initial only Henderson. He couldn't just say B. No, he had to point. They do that in the military. If all you have is a middle initial, you've got to write initial only. Well, he figured, you know what, it'd be easier if I just adopt a name. If I just stick a name in there. So he picked Bradford. I would have picked Big Thana. Clarence Big Thana Henderson. Don't mess with me. Anyway, they find out about, in verse 3, and the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, nothing. Haven't done anything for him. And the king said, oh, and at the same time, this Hanan guy is coming up to the door. And he knocks on the door and they let him in. And so the king says, let's see where. Verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Well, see, Haman thinks he's talking about him. I told you this guy was really full of himself. He thought, whoa, the king wants to honor me. Well, what should happen to me? What should I tell him? Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Hanan answered the king, for the man to whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king used to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head, and let this apparel and horse be delivered into the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So guess what the king does? The king says, okay, well, do that for Mordecai. The guy that Haman wants to kill, the guy he can't stand. So, it's just one after. Read it when you get home. It's a really good story, and I don't want to take the time to get into all of it. But once again, here they're going to destroy the entire Jewish nation that lived within the Persian Empire, and God protected them. Look at Revelation chapter 16. I want to show you something that I find very interesting here. I don't know if anybody else does, but I find it very interesting. These are plagues that fall upon the earth shortly before the second coming. Revelation chapter 16. Verses 1 and 2. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore. Now watch this, upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. It doesn't say anything about this happening to God's elect children, does it? It talks about those that have the mark of the beast and that worship his image. There's an interesting thing that I make this point all the time, that God can protect you. It doesn't matter if the worst plagues fall on this planet. It doesn't mean you're going to get them. It doesn't mean it's going to affect you at all. You want a Bible verse to prove it? Let's go to Exodus. And let's look at some of the plagues that came upon Egypt and upon Pharaoh during the days of Moses. Exodus chapter 8. Just look at a few. Exodus chapter 8, verses 20 through 23. Exodus 8:20. And the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, thus saith the Lord, Let my people go that they may serve me. Else, if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses. And the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I will sever in that day, oh, watch this, I will sever in that day the land of Goshen. What's the land of Goshen? It's where the Jews lived. Remember? They lived in Goshen. His children lived in Goshen. It was attached to it just on the other side of the river. But in Goshen, no flies. Where the Pharaoh was, flies everywhere, but not in Goshen. I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of all the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. You see, God can bring a plague upon this world and it not affect you in the least. There are those that believe that the disease of AIDS is a plague that was sent by God. How many in this room ever got it? How many in our churches ever got it? Killed millions of people. How many of us got it? The coronavirus, how many of us have got that? Well, we don't know. But my point is that, you know, the world's a big place. God can... Anybody know what's going on in China right now? I don't. I'm not in China right now. There are wildfires out west that make California, Oregon, and Washington look like Sodom and Gomorrah, but they're not affecting us. God can bring things upon people and punish people without it ever affecting God's children. He's done it in the past. Look at Exodus chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Then the Lord said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh, and tell him, Thus saith the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if thou refuse to let them go, and wilt hold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle which is in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. And the Lord shall sever between the cattle of Israel and the cattle of Egypt, and there shall nothing die of all that is in the children of Israel. Going to protect them again. And the Lord appointed a set time, saying, Tomorrow the Lord shall do this thing in the land. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle of the Israelites dead. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Look at verses 22 through 26 of the same chapter. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch forth thine hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, upon man and upon beast, and upon every herb of the field throughout the land of Egypt. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with hail, very grievous, such as there was none like in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, and all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail smote every herb of the field, and brake every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where God's people were, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. God can protect his children regardless of what goes on to everybody else. There's nothing to fear from this stuff. Yeah, we may have to go through some tough times, but that doesn't mean it's going to affect us. It might affect them and not have any direct impact on us whatsoever. So there's no reason to worry about it. God will take care of us. In chapter 11, verses 1 through 7, And the Lord said unto Moses, Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh, and upon Egypt afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, and in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. And Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, about midnight will I go out in the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And we know what happened. We know that the Israelites, this was the beginning of the Passover. And those that were faithful, they weren't touched by this. And the Egyptians were. Again, God can protect his children. He's done it in the... Now, I'm not saying that this is some sort of guarantee that nobody's ever going to get sick. So don't think that I'm saying that. And it doesn't mean that everybody's going to be protected from everything, but it's nothing to worry about. Worship God, fear him, do what he says. He'll protect you. And if there's something that befalls you, well then God wanted it to befall you, and it's our duty and obligation to do what God wants to happen. So if you happen to be one of those that ends up being a martyr, then be a martyr. But don't fear, I hear people, especially now, concerned about, well, the mark of the beast. The vaccine is going to be the mark of the beast. Is it? There's something that goes hand in hand with this whole mark of the beast thing. You go look it up. Every time it talks about the mark of the beast and somebody suffering as a result of taking the mark of the beast, it also mentions them worshiping the beast. Newsflash, don't worship the beast. It's idolatry. Don't get down and bow down to an idol of a beast. Because unless somebody tells you what the mark of the beast is, how are you going to know? So don't be too concerned with that one. Okay, Acts 18. What are we doing? I think we can probably finish this up this morning. Acts 18, verse 18. It says, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while. Then took he leave of the brethren, and sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. Now, this vow, it says that he's shorn his head. That's the past tense of shear. If you've ever seen a sheep, after they've sheared a sheep, you know what shorn means. Cut it really, really short. Kind of like, I would say that when Josh and Blake first joined the military, that their heads were shorn. They're cut down all the way right down to the nub. Still a little bit of hair showing, but not much. And it says it was because he had a vow. Now, it's not necessary to go into all the whys and wherefores of how these vows worked and what you did and all the rest of that. We don't need to go into that. They don't apply to anybody in this room. They don't apply to anybody anymore. But the important thing to notice is that it's important to see that Paul was a Jew. And Paul abided by the Jewish laws as long as those laws were in force. In fact, for him, for the rest of his life. The only thing he didn't abide by was the portion of the law that had been set aside by the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. He no longer took sheep to the temple to have them sacrificed for sin. That was taken care of with Christ. But the other portions of the law, he lived according to the law. He was a Jew. Acts chapter 21 and verse 20 through 24. And this is at a point where there were people that didn't think that Paul was living by the law anymore, and they advised him to do it. And they informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. People were saying that about Paul. They were saying that he was teaching Jews not to follow the Jewish law. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Take them and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and keeping the law. And touching the Gentiles which believe, we've written and concluded that they observe no such thing, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying them himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of the purification. So you see, Paul lived by the law. These Jewish Christians lived by the portion of the law that was still applicable. And Paul was a Jew. And that's really all we need to know relative to him having this vow, at least at this time. So he leaves Corinth. Chapter 18 again, verses 19 through 21. Saying he came to Ephesus, and left them there. The them are Priscilla and Aquila, and we're going to see that as soon as we get to chapter 19, that they stayed in Ephesus. But he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they desired him to tarry longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea and had gone up, there's that term again, had gone up. Remember, we went through the fact that anytime you went to Jerusalem, you were going up. Anytime you left Jerusalem, you were going down. Caesarea is northwest of Jerusalem, and yet he went up to Jerusalem. He landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church. He then went down to Antioch, which is due north of Jerusalem. So he goes back to Antioch, and after he'd spent some time there, he departed and went all over the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order strengthening all the disciples. So he ends his second missionary trip by leaving Corinth, going to Ephesus for a very short period of time, then sailing to Caesarea, going to Jerusalem for the feast, and then going back to Antioch, and he stayed there for a time before he started his third trip. So that ends our second trip. And next week, Lord willing, we'll pick up with him at Antioch again, beginning his third and final actually planned trip. It's at the end of this trip that he's arrested and then sent to Rome. But we've still got one more lap around Asia to get through before we get there. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning. Let's stand and be dismissed in prayer.